The heavy oak doors of the royal ballroom swung open with a resounding thud, and the atmosphere instantly turned to ice. It was a sound that signaled the end of casual chatter and the beginning of a rigid living performance. Jack Torrance, the Duke of Northwood, stepped into the golden light of 1,000 chandeliers. He was a man whose presence was felt before he was seen, a cold, towering figure of sharp angles and a gaze that could dissect a man's soul in a heartbeat. Instantly the sea of silk and lace parted. Like a field of wheat bowing to a sudden, freezing wind, every woman in the room sank into a deep, synchronized curtsy. Their eyes were dutifully fixed on the floor, their breathing shallow, their very existence narrowed down to a display of practiced obedience. The silence was so thick it felt like a physical weight, broken only by the rhythmic, predatory click of the Duke's boots against the polished marble. But as his eyes swept over the bowing masses, they stopped. At the very edge of the room, tucked away in a velvet-draped alcove by the window, a woman remained seated. She wasn't looking at him. She wasn't looking at anything but the weathered pages of a book in her lap. The breach of decorum was so absolute it felt like a gunshot in a library. "Hello, my wonderful friends. I am so incredibly happy to have you here with us for another journey. Whether you're joining from the rainy streets of Seattle, the vibrant heart of Lagos, or the quiet hills of Tuscany, please know how much your presence means to this channel. How are you all doing today? I hope you're feeling inspired and ready for a story that challenges everything we think we know about power and worth. If you haven't joined our community yet, please do hit that subscribe button. We are building something so special here together, and I truly don't want you to miss a single chapter. Are you ready to see what happens when the most powerful man in the kingdom meets the only woman who refuses to see him? Clara Vane didn't look up when the music stopped. She didn't look up when the collective intake of breath signaled the arrival of the Great Shadow, as the commoners called him. To her, the Duke of Northwood was just another man in a fancy coat, a man whose arrival meant her mother would eventually drag her away from the only peace she had found all evening. Clara's fingers traced the ink of a passage on ancient philosophy, her mind miles away from the stifling heat of the ballroom. She was a woman who had spent her life being told she was difficult, a polite word for someone who had the audacity to have a mind of her own in a world that only valued her as a decorative object. She felt the shift in the air, the sudden, unbearable tension that made the hair on her arms stand up, but she refused to give them the satisfaction. She would finish her chapter. She would stay in her world of paper and ink as long as the laws of physics allowed. But then the clicking of the boots stopped. Not near the throne. Not in the center of the room. But right beside her chair. The silence in the ballroom became a living thing, a suffocating vacuum. Lady Eleanor, Clara's mother, was surely hyperventilating somewhere in the crowd, her dreams of a social climb turning to ash. Clara felt the shadow fall over her page, blocking the moonlight she was using to read. She didn't flinch. She didn't scramble to her feet. Very slowly, with a deliberate calm that she didn't actually feel, she placed her silk ribbon bookmark between the pages. She looked up, her violet eyes meeting the Duke's icy blue stare with a terrifyingly steady gaze. She saw the sharp line of his jaw, the scar that ran through his eyebrow, and the flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Was it anger? Or was it the first spark of a fire that would burn their entire world down? Is the ending that compelling? Jack asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The ending is predictable, Clara replied, her voice clear and unwavering, cutting through the silence like a blade. It's the middle that's worth the trouble. That's where people reveal who they actually are. The room gasped as one. The Duke's eyes narrowed, his hand twitching toward the hilt of his ceremonial sword. For a moment it seemed he might strike her. But then the corner of his mouth twitched, a ghost of a smile that was more terrifying than a scowl. He didn't walk away. He didn't demand an apology. Instead, he pulled out the chair directly opposite her and sat down, ignoring the hundreds of people staring in shock. "Tell me then," he said, leaning forward until they were the only two people in the world. "In this story of ours, which part are we in now? The beginning, or the inciting incident?" The social hierarchy of the Northwood Duchy was not merely a suggestion. It was a cage of gold and glass, and Jack Torrance had spent 34 years as its principal architect. As he sat across from Clara, the weight of his own reputation pressed against him. Jack was a man born of duty and forged in the fires of the border wars. He had inherited a title that demanded he be a machine, a cold, calculating force that maintained the king's peace at any cost. His deepest fear, hidden behind a mask of aristocratic indifference, was that he had become nothing more than the marble statues that lined his ancestral halls. Impressive, immovable, and utterly hollow. He watched Clara now, not as a superior looks at a subject, but as a man who has finally found a crack in the world's artifice. Clara Vane was the daughter of a minor barony, a family whose name was whispered in the corridors of power as a cautionary tale of eccentricity. Her father, Lord Arthur Vane, had been a scholar who squandered the family's modest wealth on rare manuscripts and astronomical equipment rather than political alliances. Clara had grown up in a house where the walls were lined with the thoughts of dead poets instead of portraits of living kings. Her motivation was simple yet radical. She wanted to be the author of her own life, a desire that made her a pariah among the débutantes who measured their worth in the diameter of their waistlines and the depth of their curtsies. "You are Lord Vane's daughter," Jack said, his voice dropping to a tone that didn't reach the prying ears of the surrounding nobility. "The one who refuses to dance." "I find dancing to be a poor substitute for conversation, Your Grace," Clara replied, her fingers tracing the embossed leather of her book. "And I find the music in this room to be repetitive. Everyone plays the same notes, hoping for the same applause." Jack felt a jolt of empathy that was almost physical. He knew that repetition. He lived it every day, the same bows, the same flattery, the same desperate eyes looking for a favor or a marriage contract. He looked at her closely. Her beauty was not the polished, painted perfection of the women currently trembling in their curtsies. There was a wildness in the way her dark hair escaped its pins, a fierce intelligence in her violet eyes that seemed to see right through his uniform and his titles. "And what would you play instead?" Jack asked, his curiosity deepening into something far more dangerous. "A dissonant chord," Clara said with a small, defiant smile. "Something that wakes people up. But the world doesn't like being woken up, does it? It's much easier to sleep through a performance." In the background, Clara's mother, Lady Eleanor, finally gathered the courage to approach, her face a frantic shade of crimson. "Your Grace, please forgive my daughter. She has a delicate constitution. The heat of the ballroom has clearly affected her mind." She grabbed Clara's arm, her grip bruising. "Clara, stand up at once and apologize to the Duke for your insolence." Clara didn't move. She didn't even look at her mother. Her eyes remained locked on Jack's. The emotional stakes in the room shifted. This wasn't just a breach of etiquette anymore. It was a battle for Clara's autonomy. Jack saw the way Lady Eleanor's fingers dug into Clara's skin. He saw the flicker of pain in Clara's eyes, the only sign of weakness she had shown, and something inside him snapped. The hollowness he usually felt was suddenly replaced by a protective surge of heat. "Lady Eleanor," Jack said, his voice turning into a whip crack that made the older woman jump and release Clara's arm. "Your daughter was just explaining to me the finer points of the text she is reading. I find her constitution to be remarkably robust. In fact, I find it more refreshing than anything I have encountered this season." The surrounding crowd murmured, a low hum of disbelief. The Duke of Northwood, the man who had once exiled a count for wearing the wrong shade of blue to a state dinner, was defending a girl who wouldn't even stand up for him. "I believe," Jack continued, standing up and offering a hand to Clara, "not as a command but as a choice, that the music is about to change. Would you care to see if the middle of this story gets any more interesting, Miss Vane?" Clara looked at his hand, large, calloused and scarred. It was the hand of a man who had actually lived, not just performed. She realized that Jack Torrance was just as trapped in this ballroom as she was. His cage simply had more gilding on the bars. A hidden depth of understanding passed between them, a silent pact formed under the watchful, judging eyes of the entire court. "The middle is always where the trouble starts, Your Grace," Clara whispered, her hand hovering just inches from his. "Are you certain you're ready for a dissonant chord?" "I'm tired of the silence, Clara," he replied. As her fingers finally brushed his, a spark of pure connection ignited, a moment of vulnerability that neither of them was prepared for. But as they prepared to walk away from the window, the ballroom doors were thrown open once more, and a messenger in the king's livery rushed in, his face pale with a secret that was about to shatter the fragile peace of the evening. The messenger's boots skidded on the marble, the sound echoing like a crack of thunder in the sudden hush. He didn't stop for the master of ceremonies. He didn't wait for an introduction. He fell to one knee before Jack, gasping for air, clutching a cylinder sealed with the heavy black wax of the Royal Intelligence. "Your Grace," the man wheezed, his voice carrying just enough for the front row of the elite to catch. "The Northern Citadel. The fire has reached the archives. They say it wasn't an accident." The air in the room shifted from stagnant curiosity to a sharp, biting cold. Jack's hand, which had been gently enclosing Clara's fingers, tightened. The Northern Citadel wasn't just a fortress. It was the repository of the kingdom's history and, more importantly, the Duke's private records of the border wars. Records that contained names, secrets, truths that could topple a throne. Who was on watch? Jack demanded, his voice dropping into a register of command that made the nearby debutantes shrink back. "Sir Lawrence, and his men," the messenger replied, his head bowed. "But they found the gates locked from the inside." Jack's jaw set into a grim line of granite. He turned to the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the nobility. He didn't see shock, he saw calculations. He saw men wondering if their own secrets had burned or if they had just gained a new weapon. But it was Clara's reaction that caught him off guard. She didn't look afraid. She was looking at the messenger with an intensity that mirrored Jack's own. She wasn't a girl lost in a book anymore. She was a woman dissecting a puzzle. "The archives aren't flammable," Clara whispered, leaning toward Jack. Every eye in the room was on them now. The scandal of her sitting was forgotten, replaced by the horror of her speaking during a crisis. "The walls are 3-foot stone and the scrolls are kept in lead-lined canisters. To burn that library you wouldn't need a torch. You'd need an accelerant. Something alchemical." Jack looked at her, his pulse quickening. He was right. The archives were designed to survive a siege. "How do you know the composition of the Citadel's storage?" Jack asked, his gaze searching hers. "My father helped design the ventilation system 20 years ago," she replied, her voice steady despite the frantic whispering of the crowd. "If it's burning, someone didn't just light a fire. They turned the building into a furnace." This was the moment the world outside the ballroom finally tore the veil. Jack realized that this girl, the one who refused to curtsy, wasn't just a distraction. She was a key. "Your Grace," Lady Eleanor hissed, stepping forward to snatch Clara's hand back. "Enough of this nonsense. Claire, you are overstepping. We must leave at once before you further embarrass the vain name." "She stays," Jack said, the command absolute. He didn't look at Eleanor, he looked at the messenger. "Ready my horse. And a carriage for Miss Vane." The room erupted in a chaotic murmuring. Taking a woman to a military disaster was unheard of, a breach of every social and legal protocol. "You can't take her," a voice called out from the back. It was Lord Sterling, a man with a smile like a shark and eyes that had been tracking Jack's every move. "The girl is a civilian, Jack. Not to mention the prime suspect's daughter if we're talking about architects of the ventilation." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Clara's face went pale, but she didn't flinch. She looked at Jack, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the decision in his eyes. The moment he had to choose between the safety of his reputation and the intuition that told him this girl was the only one who understood the mechanics of the crime. "I am the Duke of Northwood," Jack said, stepping towards Sterling with a presence that seemed to grow until he filled the room. "I do not take advice on suspects from men who owe the crown half their fortune in back taxes." He turned back to Clara, his hand extending once more. This time the stakes weren't just social. "Clara, if what you say is true, my past is currently being erased by a fire that shouldn't exist. I need someone who knows the bones of that building. I need someone who isn't afraid of the heat." Clara looked at the book she had been reading, a treatise on logic. She looked at her mother, who was already mourning their social standing. Then she looked at the Duke. He wasn't asking her to curtsy. He was asking her to fight. She stood up. For the first time all night she was on her feet, but she wasn't bowing. She was rising. "I'll need my father's original schematics," she said, her voice ringing through the ballroom. "And a pair of gloves. If we're going into a furnace, I don't intend to get burned." As they turned to leave the ballroom, walking side by side through the sea of stunned aristocrats, a shadow moved in the gallery above. A figure in dark robes watched them go, a small silver vial glinting in the candlelight. The fire at the Citadel was only the first spark. The Duke had found his match, but the world was determined to see them both reduced to ash. The night air was a biting contrast to the stifling heat of the ballroom as the Duke's black stallion thundered down the mountain pass, the carriage carrying Clara following in a desperate, swaying pursuit. Ahead, the horizon was bruised with an unnatural, flickering orange glow. The northern citadel, a fortress that had stood for 3 centuries, was bleeding smoke into the clouds. When they arrived, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Soldiers threw buckets of water against stone walls that hissed in protest, the steam rising like ghosts. Jack was off his horse before it had even come to a full stop, his heavy cloak billowing behind him. He didn't head for the commander. He ran straight to the carriage door, ripping it open. Clara stepped out, her silk gown already soot-stained at the hem. She didn't complain about the cold or the stench of burning parchment. She looked up at the east tower where the fire was most intense. "The ventilation shafts," she said, her voice tight with focus. "They're acting like bellows. If we don't block the intake on the roof, the archives will be gone within the hour." "It's too hot for the men to reach the roof," a captain shouted, running toward them. "The stone is cracking." "Then we don't use the stairs," Clara countered, pulling a rolled parchment from her satchel, her father's original schematics. She spread it over the damp stone of a well cover. "The service lift for the coal. It's lined with iron. If someone small enough can get inside, they can reach the lever to seal the vents from the interior." Jack looked at the narrow opening she was pointing to, then at her. The tension between them was no longer the electric pull of a ballroom. It was the high-stakes friction of 2 people standing on the edge of a precipice. "No," Jack said, his voice flat. "It's a suicide mission. The smoke will choke you before you reach the 3rd floor. I'm the only one who knows which lever to pull, Jack." Clara snapped, using his name for the first time without his title. The word hung between them, more intimate than a touch. "You want to save your secrets? Then let me do what I was born to do. I've spent my life reading about heroes. Let me be one." Jack's jaw tightened. He looked at the tower, then back at the woman who had dared to sit while the world bowed. He realized he wasn't just afraid of losing the archives. He was terrified of the silence that would follow if her voice was extinguished. "I'm going with you," he commanded. "You're too broad for the lift," she said, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. "Stay at the base. If the lift doesn't come back down in 10 minutes, then the story ends." Against his every instinct of protection, Jack helped her into the iron-clad coal lift. He handed her his own leather gloves and a dampened silk cloth for her face. As he lowered the iron gate, their fingers brushed through the bars. A brief, searing contact that felt like a promise. "Clara," he whispered, his eyes dark with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a decade. "Come back. The middle of the story isn't over yet." As the lift began its slow, mechanical ascent into the choking blackness of the tower, Jack turned to his men, his voice a roar of renewed purpose. "Get the ladders to the east wing. If she seals those vents, we have one window to get the water inside." But as Clara ascended, she realized the fire wasn't her only enemy. Halfway up through the gaps in the iron cage, she saw a figure moving through the smoke-filled corridor. It was the man in the dark robes from the ballroom. He wasn't trying to put out the fire. He was pouring a thick, shimmering liquid onto the remaining crates of records. The red herring of the accidental fire vanished. This was an execution. And the Duke's past wasn't the only thing being targeted. The figure turned, and through the haze, Clara recognized the ring on his finger. It belonged to Lord Sterling. The lift lurched to a halt. Clara was trapped in the shaft, the heat beginning to blister the paint on the iron walls. Sterling looked toward the lift, a cruel smile spreading across his face as he raised a heavy iron bar to jam the mechanism. Down below, Jack felt the tension in the pulley system go slack. His heart plummeted. "Clara," he roared, his hands gripping the ropes until they bled. The tension was at its breaking point. The woman who read by the window was now staring into the face of a murderer, while the man who commanded the world found himself powerless to reach her. The heat inside the coal lift was no longer a physical sensation. It was a living predator clawing at Clara's lungs. Through the iron slats, she watched Lord Sterling approach the lift's mechanism. The orange glow of the furnace-like corridor illuminated his face, stripping away the mask of the polished aristocrat to reveal a man possessed by a frantic, jagged desperation. "You should have stayed in your book, Miss Vane," Sterling shouted over the roar of the flames. He swung the iron bar, jamming it into the gears. The lift groaned, lurching violently as the cable strained against the obstruction. Some chapters are sealed for a reason. Clara pressed the damp cloth to her face, her eyes stinging. You're not just burning records, Sterling. You're burning the truth about the border wars. What are you hiding? Sterling paused, his hand trembling on the bar. I'm not hiding anything. I'm correcting a mistake. Jack Torrance thinks he's a hero because he survived the siege of Blackwood. He doesn't realize that his own father was the one who opened the gates. Those records prove the Northwoods are traitors, not the Sterlings. The revelation hit Clara harder than the heat. The Duke's entire identity, his rigid adherence to duty, and his obsession with the crown were built on a foundation he believed was untainted. If Jack's father had been the traitor, Jack wasn't a guardian of the realm, he was the son of its greatest enemy. Down below, Jack didn't wait for the gears to unjam. He saw the lift stall and the smoke thicken. With a reckless disregard for his own safety, he grabbed a discarded grappling hook from the fire crew and hurled it toward the third-floor balcony. It bit into the stone. Your Grace, no. The masonry is brittle, the captain yelled. Jack ignored him. He climbed, his muscles screaming, his hands blistering as he touched the heated stone. He reached the balcony just as Sterling was preparing to pour the last of the alchemical accelerant into the lift shaft to finish Clara once and for all. Jack vaulted over the railing, a shadow born of ash and fury. He didn't use his sword, he tackled Sterling with the raw weight of his body. The two men crashed into the stone floor, sliding through the layer of soot. You! Sterling hissed, scrambling back. You're too late, Jack. The scrolls are ash. Your father's shame is gone and you're going to burn with the evidence. Jack stood up, his breathing ragged. He looked at the lift where Clara was slumped against the bars, then back at Sterling. My father's shame? He sold the North Pass for 10,000 gold sovereigns. Sterling laughed manically. It's in the ledger. I saw it before I lit the match. Clara found a surge of strength. She reached through the bars, her fingers catching on the lever her father had designed decades ago. He's lying, Jack, she choked out. With a final, desperate shove, she threw the lever. A massive iron plate slammed shut deep within the tower's throat, cutting off the oxygen to the ventilation shafts. The roar of the fire instantly changed from a predatory howl to a suffocating hiss. The backdraft caused a sudden violent pressure shift that blew out the remaining windows, sending a cloud of soot and heat spiraling into the night. In the sudden eerie silence of the dying fire, Clara looked at a single charred scroll that had been kicked near the lift during the struggle. It hadn't burned completely. The edges were black, but the center was pristine. Jack, she whispered, her voice trembling as she reached for it. Jack ignored Sterling, who was cowering against the wall as the smoke cleared. He moved to the lift, ripping the iron bar from the gears with a feat of strength fueled by pure adrenaline. He opened the gate and pulled Clara into his arms. She wasn't looking at him with pity. She was looking at him with a fierce, burning passion. She handed him the scroll. It wasn't your father, Jack, she said, her voice echoing in the hollow tower. Look at the seal. Jack unrolled the parchment. It wasn't a ledger of treason. It was a royal pardon signed by the previous king, hidden for 20 years. It detailed how Jack's father had acted as a double agent to trap the real traitors, the Sterlings. The Sterlings hadn't been the victims of the war. They had been the architects of the betrayal, and they had spent 2 decades making Jack believe he owed a debt of blood to the crown just to keep him under their thumb. The stakes hadn't just been raised, the entire world had been flipped. The Duke looked at the cowering man on the floor. The man who had commanded him, mocked him, and nearly killed the only woman who ever truly saw him. Jack's vulnerability broke through. He leaned his forehead against Clara's, his hand gripping the scroll that restored his soul. But as the romantic tension peaked in the middle of the ruins, a new sound emerged from the courtyard below, the sound of 100 horses. The king's personal guard had arrived. And they weren't there to help. They were there to ensure that whatever secrets the fire missed, the sword finished. The arrival of the king's guard wasn't the sound of salvation. It was the rhythmic, metallic clatter of a closing trap. From the high balcony of the smoldering tower, Jack and Clara looked down to see the courtyard flooded with silver-armored riders. At their head was Commander Vane, Clara's own cousin, a man whose loyalty was bought with the gold of the High Council. They aren't here for Sterling, Jack whispered, his voice like grinding stones. He tucked the charred scroll into his tunic, the parchment still warm against his chest. They're here to make sure no one walks out of this tower with the truth. Sterling, seeing his opening, scrambled to his feet with a jagged laugh. You think a piece of paper makes you a hero, Jack? In this kingdom, the truth is whatever the king says it is. And right now, the king says you're a madman who burned the archives to hide his father's sins. Clara, get behind me, Jack commanded, drawing his rapier. But as he stepped toward the stairs, a heavy iron portcullis slammed down, sealing the exit. Simultaneously, the sound of boots echoed from the roof. The iron guard was descending from above, rappelling down the stone walls like spiders of steel. They were trapped, separated from the Duke's loyal men below by a wall of flame and stone, and cut off from escape by a force that didn't care about justice, only silence. Jack, look at me, Clara said, her voice trembling but her eyes fixed on his. She took his hand, her fingers blackened with soot but her grip like iron. If we stay here, we die. If we surrender, they'll burn that scroll and we'll still die. The separation felt imminent. The iron guard burst through the high windows, their steam-powered gauntlets hissing. Jack fought with a desperation that bordered on madness, his blade a blur of silver in the smoke. But for every man he struck down, 2 more stepped over the bodies. He was being pushed back toward the crumbling edge of the balcony, away from Clara. Take it! Jack roared, ripping the scroll from his tunic and thrusting it into Clara's hands. The service lift. It still works on the manual crank. Go, Clara. Get to the king's brother. He's the only one who can challenge the council. I won't leave you, she cried, her voice cracking as a guard's heavy mace shattered the stone railing inches from her feet. You have to. Jack's eyes were filled with a raw, agonizing despair. He had spent his life in a cage of duty, and just as he found a reason to live outside of it, he was being forced to lose it. If you stay, the story ends here. If you go, we have a chance at a different ending. He shoved her toward the small iron cage of the coal lift and slammed the gate. With a grunt of exertion, he hacked at the primary support cable with his sword. Jack, no. I love you, Clara, he breathed, the words lost to the roar of the wind and the hissing of steam. The cable snapped. The lift plummeted, not into a free fall but into the controlled, dark descent of the secondary shaft. Clara's last image of the Duke was him standing alone against a dozen blades, his silhouette framed by the dying orange embers of his father's legacy. She hit the bottom of the shaft with a bone-jarring thud. The darkness of the Citadel's basement was absolute. She was alone, smelling of smoke and heartbreak, clutching a piece of paper that felt heavier than the world. Outside, she could hear the commander's voice ordering the tower to be brought down. They were going to bury the Duke in the ruins of the archives. Clara slumped against the cold iron bars, the silence of the basement more terrifying than the fire. She had no weapons, no title, and the man who had looked her in the eye and seen a person was being erased above her. For the first time since she had sat by the window, the weight of the world felt insurmountable. She was just a girl with a book, and the heroes she read about always had a sword. But as she touched the charred scroll, she felt the heat of the fire still trapped in the parchment. She realized she didn't need a sword. She had the one thing the council feared more than the Duke's blade, the story. And she was going to make sure the world heard it. The darkness of the Citadel's basement smelled of damp earth and ancient neglect. Clara lay in the wreckage of the coal lift, her lungs burning, her heart a jagged shard of grief. Above her, the muffled sounds of structural collapse echoed through the stone. The tower was being systematically dismantled, a tomb being built in real time for the man who had just told her he loved her. I am just a reader, she whispered into the dark, her voice a broken rasp. I am just a girl from a minor house. But then her hand brushed against the charred scroll. She remembered the way Jack had looked at her, not as a minor noble but as an equal. He hadn't asked her to bow, he had asked her to fight. If she stayed in this basement, she was agreeing with the council that she was nothing. The realization struck her like a lightning bolt. The middle of the story is where people reveal who they actually are. Clara scrambled to her feet. She didn't have a sword, but she knew the bones of this building better than the men currently trying to level it. She remembered the schematics. The ventilation shafts didn't just lead to the roof. They connected to the old Roman aqueducts that ran beneath the city. With a strength born of pure, defiant hope, she pushed aside a heavy iron grate. She crawled into the narrow, wet tunnel, the soot on her skin washing away in the frigid water. She wasn't fleeing, she was repositioning. Meanwhile, in the ruins above, Jack Torrance was not dead. He was a man built of scars and iron, and he had found a pocket of air beneath a fallen oak rafter. He pushed against the stone, his muscles screaming, blood trickling into his eyes. He heard the iron guard mocking his name, calling him a traitor. "Not today," Jack hissed. He found his rapier, the blade bent but unbroken. He remembered Clara's face, the violet fire in her eyes when she refused to stand. If she was out there carrying the truth, he had to be the shield that gave her time to speak it. He didn't just crawl out, he erupted from the rubble. The first iron guard didn't even have time to scream before Jack's blade found the chink in his steam armor. The Duke was no longer a man of etiquette. He was a force of nature. "Where is the girl?" the commander roared, leveling a crossbow at Jack. "She's somewhere you can't reach, Vane," Jack said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "She's in the one place your gold can't buy. She's in the truth." Just then a sound began to echo from the city square beyond the citadel walls. It wasn't the sound of a battle. It was the sound of a voice. Clara had emerged from the aqueducts directly into the great plaza, where the morning market was beginning to gather. She didn't look like a lady, she looked like a survivor. She climbed the base of the hero's statue, clutching the charred scroll. "People of Northwood," her voice rang out, amplified by the natural acoustics of the stone circle. "The fire at the citadel wasn't an accident. It was a funeral for the truth. Look at this seal. Look at the king's own hand." The crowd paused. The soldiers at the gate hesitated. The commander, realizing the narrative was slipping through his fingers, ordered a charge, but he was met with a wall of commoners, the people who had been inspired by the girl who wouldn't curtsy. Jack, seeing the distraction from the balcony, fought his way toward the courtyard. He saw the shift in the soldiers' eyes. They weren't looking at a traitor. They were looking at a man who had been wronged. The turning point wasn't a miracle. It was a realization. The Duke and the Reader had united the two halves of the kingdom, the power of the sword and the power of the word. "To the plaza!" Jack shouted to his remaining loyalists. The hope that had been a flicker in a dark basement was now a roaring bonfire in the heart of the city. The Duke was coming for his queen, and this time the whole world was going to watch. The great plaza was a sea of humanity, a churning tide of merchants, peasants, and low-ranking soldiers, all frozen by the sight of the soot-stained woman atop the statue. Clara held the charred scroll aloft like a holy relic, her voice echoing off the cathedral walls. But the commander's elite guard was closing in, their pikes leveled, their faces hidden behind cold steel visors. "Silence her," the commander screamed, spurred by the sight of Lord Stirling galloping into the square on a lathered horse, his face twisted in a mask of panic. "She's a conspirator. A spy for the northern rebels." The soldiers surged forward, but the crowd didn't break. They were the people who lived in the silence Jack Torrance had enforced for years, but now they saw a woman who had broken that silence with a single book and a mountain of courage. Suddenly, the heavy iron gates of the citadel burst open. Jack Torrance didn't ride out, he marched. He was covered in ash, his tunic shredded, and his rapier snapped to half its length, but he looked more like a duke than he ever had in a ballroom. Behind him followed the remnants of his loyal guard and, surprisingly, the common soldiers of the citadel who had laid down their arms for the commander. "Stand down." Jack's voice was a seismic event, stopping the charging guard in their tracks. He didn't head for the commander. He walked straight through the parting crowd, his eyes locked on Clara. She looked down from the statue, and the relief that washed over her face was more radiant than the morning sun. He reached up, his hand steady and bloodied, and helped her down. "The scroll, Jack," she whispered, handing it to him. "The truth belongs to you." "No," Jack said, turning to face Lord Stirling and the commander. "The truth belongs to the people they've been lying to for 20 years. Lord Stirling drew his sword, his eyes darting like a trapped rat's. "It's a forgery. The archives are gone. My word is the only law left." "Then your law is built on a graveyard," Jack countered. He held the scroll high, the royal seal unmistakable even in its charred state. "This is the pardon of the late king. It names the Stirlings as the architects of the Blackwood massacre. It proves that the men who have held the strings of this duchy are the very traitors they claimed to hunt." The commander, seeing the tide turn, raised his crossbow, aiming directly at Jack's heart. A piece of paper doesn't stop a bolt, Your Grace. But before he could fire, Clara stepped forward. She didn't have a weapon, but she had the logic she had spent her life perfecting. If you kill him, Commander, you prove every word on that parchment is true. You prove that the Crown's law is just a cloak for murder. Look at your men. Do they look like they're ready to die for a lie? The soldiers lowered their pikes. One by one, the heavy steel tips hit the cobblestones with a series of rhythmic metallic clangs. They looked at the Duke, then at the girl who had dared to read when she should have bowed. Sterling, realizing he had lost the soldiers, lunged at Jack in a final desperate act of cowardice. Jack didn't even flinch. He parried the heavy broadsword with his broken rapier, the steel screaming. With a fluid, brutal efficiency, he disarmed Sterling and pinned him to the base of the statue, the broken tip of his blade hovering a fraction of an inch from the man's throat. I should kill you for what you did to the archives, Jack hissed, his eyes burning with a decade of repressed fury. I should kill you for what you tried to do to her. Then do it. Sterling spat. Be the monster they say you are. Jack looked at Clara. She didn't nod in encouragement of the kill. She looked at him with a quiet, profound expectation. He wanted the man, not the monster. No, Jack said, pulling his blade back. That's the ending you wrote. We're writing a new one. He turned to his loyalists. Seize them. They will stand trial not in a secret court but here. In the plaza. Under the eyes of the people they betrayed. The cheers that erupted were deafening, a roar of triumph that shook the very foundations of the city. Jack turned back to Clara, the adrenaline fading, replaced by an overwhelming vulnerability. He reached out and tucked a stray soot-covered lock of hair behind her ear. You did it, he breathed. You changed the music. We did, she said, her voice a soft anchor in the storm. In that moment, amidst the ruins of their old lives and the cheers of a liberated city, the Duke and the reader stood as equals. The most surprising twist wasn't the secret in the scroll. It was that the most powerful man in the world had been saved by the one woman who refused to acknowledge his power until he earned it. The following months were a whirlwind of restoration, not just of the charred stones of the citadel, but of the very spirit of Northwood. The High Council was dissolved, and Lord Sterling and the commander were sentenced to work the very lands they had sought to corrupt, their titles stripped and their names written into the history books as the final villains of an old era. But the most significant change wasn't in the laws. It was in the ballroom. A new season had begun, and the royal palace was once again filled with the scent of lilies and the hum of 100 violins. This time, however, the doors didn't open to a room of fearful silence. When the Duke of Northwood was announced, the music didn't stop. People didn't freeze. There was a warmth in the air, a sense of genuine respect rather than practiced obedience. Jack Torrance stepped into the light, his uniform pristine, his gaze no longer cold but bright with a newfound purpose. He walked through the crowd, nodding to soldiers and merchants alike. But he didn't head for the throne. He walked straight to the window. There, in the same velvet-draped alcove, sat Clara Vane. She wasn't wearing a tattered shift or soot-stained silk. She was dressed in a gown of deep violet that matched the fire in her eyes. And in her lap, as always, was a book. This time as he approached, she didn't wait for the shadow to fall over her page. She closed the book and stood up. She didn't curtsy. She didn't lower her eyes. She stood as a sovereign peer, a woman whose mind had saved a dukedom. I believe this is where the story provides emotional closure, Jack said, a genuine, beautiful smile breaking across his face. Is it? Clara teased, her hand finding his. I thought this was the part where the characters decide on their next adventure. Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound volume. I spent the last month in the restored archives. I found a manuscript your father started but never finished. It's a study on the stars of the Northern Hemisphere. He placed it in her hands. I thought perhaps we could finish the chapters together. Clara traced the gold leaf lettering of her father's name, her eyes shimmering with tears of fulfillment. You remembered. I remember everything about the woman who refused to see me until I was worth seeing, Jack whispered. He didn't care about the eyes of the court. He leaned in and kissed her. A kiss that tasted of new beginnings and a love that had been earned through fire and truth. The ballroom erupted in a cheer that was far more sincere than any bow could ever be. Clara looked out the window at the city below, where the lights were burning bright and the people were free to write their own stories. She was no longer a girl hiding in the pages of someone else's life. She was the architect of her own destiny, standing beside a man who loved her not for her silence, but for her voice. The music changed then, shifting from a rigid march to a sweeping, joyous waltz. Jack offered his hand, and for the first time in his life he didn't lead. He moved in harmony with the woman who had taught him that the best stories don't happen when you follow the rules. They happen when you're brave enough to break them. Thank you all so much for being a part of this incredible journey tonight. Seeing Clara and Jack move from that silent, frozen ballroom to a life of shared light and truth, it just fills my heart with so much joy. What was your favorite moment? Was it the revelation in the tower or that final waltz? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. I love reading your theories. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of love and defiance. Stay brave, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next chapter. Sending so much love to all of you.